Hello, everybody. I hope you all are having a pleasant day. It's time for another reading of Neal Stephenson's In the Beginning Was the Command Line. And, again, this book was written in 1999. And the more I read into it, the more I love reading this stuff because what you read in the 90s, it's like he talks about the GUI, he talks the command line interface, he talks about Bill Gates, the way things were, how Apple was the underdog back then. And it's just like, here we are like 20 plus years later, and it's like some things have just changed completely, and some things are just the same growing. I mean, this was before social media, this was before crypto and Bitcoin and all this stuff. So it's just a very interesting read. And so I also just want to point out that he likes to open up his book talking about H.G. Wells' The Time Machine with the Eloi and the Morlocks. If you're not familiar with that book, you should go grab a copy of it, or at least watch. Maybe you could probably just watch the movie on YouTube. It's probably already been downloaded. But very interesting, and he's going to make a lot of references to it. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started here. And I'm sorry, I should make one more point. I'm a little short on time. So in the interest of getting you maybe a chapter, maybe two in, I'm going to probably have to rush this reading a little bit. It may not be as refined or as well edited as some of my other readings. So please forgive me for that. And just sit back and enjoy. The OS has therefore become sort of a intellectual labor-saving device that tries to translate humans' vaguely expressed intentions into bits. In effect, we are asking our computers to shoulder responsibilities that have always been considered the province of human beings. We want them to understand our desires, to anticipate our needs, to foresee consequences, to make connections, to handle routine chores without being asked, to remind us that we are to be reminded of while filtering out noise. At the upper, which is to say closer to the user levels, this is done through a set of conventions, menus, buttons, and so on. These work in the same sense that analogies work. They help Eloi understand abstract or unfamiliar concepts by likening them to something known. But the loftier word metaphor is used. The overarching concept of the Mac OS was the desktop metaphor, and it subsumed any number of lesser and frequently conflicting or at least mixed metaphors. Under a GUI, a file, frequently called document, is metaphrased as a window on the screen, which is called a desktop. The window is almost always too small to contain the document, and so you move around, or more pretentiously, navigate in the document by clicking and dragging the thumb on the scroll bar. When you type using a keyboard or draw using a mouse into the window, or use pull-down menus and dialog boxes to manipulate its contents, the results of your labors get stored, at least in theory, in a file, and later you can pull the same information back up into another window. When you don't want it anymore, you drag it into the trash. There is massively promiscuous metaphor mixing going on here, and I could deconstruct it till the cows come home, but I won't. Consider only one word: document. When we document something in the real world, we make fixed, permanent, immutable records of it. But computer documents are volatile, ephemeral constellations of data, sometimes as when you've just opened or saved them. The document as portrayed in the window is identical to what is stored under the same name in a file on the disk, but other times, as when you have made changes without saving them, it is completely different. In any case, every time you hit save, you annihilate the previous version of the document and replace it with whatever happens to be in the window at the moment. So even the word save is being used in a sense that is grotesquely misleading. Destroy one version, save another would be more accurate. Anyone who uses a word processor for very long inevitably has the experience of putting hours of work into a long document and then losing it because the computer crashes or the power goes out. Until the moment that it disappears from the screen, the document seems every bit as solid and real as if it had been typed out in ink on paper. But in the next moment, without warning, most people who shop for OSs, if they bother to shop at all, are comparing not the underlying functions, but the superficial look and feel. The average buyer of an OS is not really paying for and is not especially interested in the low-level code that allocates memory or writes bytes onto the disk. What they're really buying is a system of metaphors. And much more important, what we're buying into is an underlying assumption that metaphors are a good way to deal with the world. Recently, a lot of new hardware has become available that gives computers numerous interesting ways of affecting the real world, making paper spew out of printers, causing words to appear on screen thousands of miles away, shooting beams of radiation through cancer patients, creating realistic moving pictures of the Titanic. Windows is now used as an OS for cash registers and bank tellers terminals. My satellite TV system uses a sort of GUI to change channels and show program guides. Modern cellular telephones have a crude GUI built into a tiny LCD screen. Even Legos now have a GUI. You can buy a Lego set called Mindstorms that enables you to build little Lego robots and program them through a GUI on your computer. So we are now asking the GUI to do a lot more than serve as a glorified typewriter. Now we want it to become a generalized tool for dealing with reality. This has become a bonanza for companies that make a living out of bringing new technology to the mass market. Obviously, you cannot sell a complicated technological system to people without some sort of interface that enables them to use it. The internal combustion engine was a technological marvel in its day, but useless as a consumer good until a clutch, transmission, steering wheel, and throttle were connected to it. The odd collection of gizmos, which survive to this day in every car on the road, made up what we would call a user interface. But if cars had been invented after Macintoshes, car makers would not have bothered to gin up all of these arcane devices. We would have a computer screen instead of a dashboard and a mouse, or at least a joystick, instead of a steering wheel. And we'd shift gears by pulling down a menu. Park, reverse, neutral, 3, 2, 1, help. A few lines of computer code can thus be made to substitute for any imaginable mechanical interface. The problem is that in many cases the substitute is a poor one. Driving a car through a GUI would be a miserable experience. Even if the GUI was perfectly bug-free, it would be incredibly dangerous because menus and buttons simply can't be responsive as direct mechanical controls. My friend's dad, the gentleman who was restoring the MGB, never would have bothered with it if it had been equipped with a GUI. It wouldn't have been any fun. The steering wheel and gear shift lever were invented during an era when the most complicated technology in most homes was a butter churn. These early car makers were simply lucky in that they could dream up whatever interface was best suited to the task of driving an automobile, and people would learn it. Likewise, with the dial telephone and the AM radio, by the time of the Second World War, most people knew several interfaces. They could not only churn butter, but also drive a car, dial a telephone, turn on a radio, summon flame from a cigarette lighter, and change a light bulb. But now every little thing, wristwatches, VCRs, stoves, is jammed with features, and every feature is useless without an interface. If you are like me and like most other consumers, you have never used 90% of the available features on your microwave oven, VCR, or cell phone. You don't even know that these features exist. The small benefit they might bring you is outweighed by the sheer hassle of having to learn about them. This has got to be a big problem for makers of consumer goods because they can't compete without offering features. It is no longer acceptable for engineers to invent a wholly novel user interface for every new product as they did in the case of the automobile, partly because it's too expensive and partly because ordinary people can only learn so much. If the VCR had been invented 100 years ago, it would have come with a thumb wheel to adjust the tracking and gear shift to change between forward and reverse, and a big cast iron handle to load or to eject the cassettes. It would have had a big analog clock on the front of it, and you would have had set the time by moving the hands around on the dial. But because the VCR was invented when it was, during a sort of awkward transitional period between the era of mechanical interfaces and GUIs, it just had a bunch of push buttons on the front, and in order to set the time, you had to push the buttons in just the right way. This must have seemed reasonable enough to the engineers responsible for it, but to many users, it was simply impossible. Thus, the famous blinking 12 o'clock that appears on so many VCRs. Computer people call this the blinking 12 problem. When they talk about it, though, they usually aren't talking about VCRs. Modern VCRs usually have some kind of on-screen programming, which means that you can set the time and control other features through a sort of primitive GUI. GUIs have virtual push buttons too, of course, but they also have other types of virtual controls like radio buttons, check boxes, text entry boxes, dials, and scroll bars. Interfaces made out of these components seem to be a lot easier for many people than pushing those little buttons on the front of the machine. And so the blinking 12 o'clock itself is slowly disappearing from America's living rooms. The blinking 12 problem has moved on to plague other technologies. So the GUI has gone beyond being an interface to personal computers and has become a sort of meta interface that is pressed into service for every new piece of computer technology. It is rarely an idea fit, but having an idea or even a good interface is no longer the priority. The important thing now is having some kind of interface that customers will actually use so that manufacturers can claim with a straight face that they are offering new features. We want GUIs larger because they are convenient and because they are easy, or at least the GUIs make it seem that way. Of course, nothing is really easy and simple, and putting a nice interface on top of it does not change that fact. A car controlled through a GUI would be easier to drive than one controlled through pedals and steering wheel, but it would be incredibly dangerous. By using GUIs all the time, we have insensibly bought into a premise that few people would have accepted if it were presented to them bluntly, namely, that hard things can be made easy and complicated things simple by putting the right interface on them. In order to understand how bizarre this is, imagine that book reviews were written according to the same value systems that we apply to user interfaces. The writer in this book is marvelously simple-minded and glib. The author glosses over complicated subjects and employs facial generalizations in almost every sentence. Readers rarely have to think and are spared all of the difficulty and tedium typically involved in reading old-fashioned books. As long as we stick to simple operations like setting the clocks on our VCRs, this is not so bad. But as we try to do more ambitious things with our technologies, we inevitably run into the problem of metaphor shear. Okay, that will be the next chapter. So we're going to stop right here and let me make some comments. Oh my gosh. It's just, again, it's so weird. Like, he talks about the GUI. All right, for those who are not old enough to remember, the GUIs first came out in like maybe the mid-1980s. And I think he mentions it in the book too. Apple was the first one to come out with it. Like I mentioned earlier, I learned how to use MS-DOS, which was command line interface. Okay. Now, here we are in 1999. By the time 1999 rolls around, we're starting to see some maturity in the technology industry. There's a little bit more standardization in operating systems. You have I think Microsoft Word was now at that time starting to become the number one word processor instead of having a dozen different word processor programs. Things are getting narrowed down. The OSs were mainly Mac, Mac OS and Windows. And so just remember, everything he talks about, the Windows document, it's the same today. Most of the way we interface with a GUI has not changed much in the 20 plus years. The only big difference is now we have tablets, and so you can take your little stylus pen and connect with, take your little pen and connect with a window, a document. But even that's basically the same. So on the one hand, I think it, if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? It does work. And so it's easy to teach a new person or a kid or an old person how to do it because it's been around for so long. But on the other hand, you got to stop and wonder. It's like, wow, hey, we've had this for like 30 plus years. Isn't it time for a new interface, a new way of doing business? If you have a desktop computer, we're still mainly doing keyboard and mouse. What about holographic keyboards or something? Even like touchscreen is just barely used. Most computers, is like your desktop computers and laptops, most of them still do not use, like, say, touchscreen. I like how he uses old-fashioned. That's right. Before the word old school became popular, which I started here in the early 2000s, about 20 years ago, old-fashioned was the word we used. I just thought that was kind of cute in there. It's just, again, you look at how these things are built. And I like how he talks about the VCRs. What's funny is DVDs came out in the 90s. My first DVD player I bought in 1996, and it was like $400, and that was open box. Incredibly expensive. I think expensive now. $400 back then was even more expensive. But what I find humorous is he doesn't even talk about DVDs. Interesting. But anyway, it's just so interesting. And he talks about like the GUI interface on cars. Largely true still. We still use steering wheels, gear shifts and all, but this was written a decade before the first Tesla came out in 2009. I wonder if Neal Stephenson, if he could write this book like, a revised edition, I wonder what changes we can make in line of now that you have the Tesla, which does have a GUI interface on it for a lot of its stuff. Just a thought. But all right, that's enough reading for tonight. Thank you all for listening. You all have a good evening, and I will catch you later. Bye.